I've played in a good amount of post-apocalyptic horror games through this guy named Jordan. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG Podcast. I am Clayton.
Kyle Perkins, back in the saddle again.
And Eliot Jacobs. 3 times a charm.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia, where if you enjoy our content and would like to help us with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for joining us today, and we are talking about horror games now. We're talking about how to plan, pace, and run a horror game. So, I've been running horror games pretty much since I've been playing role-playing games. The first horror game I ever ran was a Call of Cthulhu game. That was maybe a year or two after I started GMing in earnest. So, it's been with me since the beginning. What are you guys' experience with horror in the RPG realm?
Well, you're all, if you've listened to this podcast at all now, familiar with the kind of post-apocalyptic survival horror stuff that a lot of us are fans of. But I'm going to classify that as a different kind of game than what we're trying to hopefully help you figure out how to run and play in today. Like, pure horror-wise, I've played in a couple of very short, kind of like, 1 to 5 shot level games. And I've ran a horror one-shot, the same one that I wrote for 3 different groups of people, which was pretty cool, being able to refine that over time and have different groups of people get different levels of scared. Fun times. It's a cool genre. It's something I really enjoy running, and I like to add elements of horror into my other games. I did that in Eclipse Phase as well, but pure horror games, I wouldn't say I'm the most experienced.
For those of you who are just dipping your toe in or just getting started, I gotta say I'm probably going to be the one speaking for you guys, because horror is, I'm kind of a newcomer to the horror scene. I'm running a Ravenloft campaign right now, which is kind of like the D&D quintessential horror game in that canon. But as far as past experience goes, other than just like most people having seen some of the great horror movies out there, being somewhat familiar with H.P. Lovecraft's work, and right now I'm reading through a somewhat horror, I guess it's horror, fantasy. I'm reading through the Elric of Melniboné stuff. That's kind of where I'm at, and so I think I'm going to be able to speak to some struggles of maintaining and keeping the fear up in the suspense in a game. I'm looking to learn a lot actually from this podcast.
Kyle, I think you really hit a very major point that I want to go over with pretty much in depth, where you said that you've done one-shots, you've done short-form horror games, but you really haven't done long-form horror games. I feel like long-form horror games are probably one of the hardest things to run in role-playing games, because you run into a problem that John McClane ran into or expressed in the second Die Hard movie. How can the same shit keep happening to the same guy?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. I can't even imagine trying to plan and run one. I just don't think you can keep up that erection for so long. I mean, it's difficult. I get like maybe 30 minutes if I'm lucky here. Oh wait, by that I mean keep up the atmosphere.
Champion. That's kind of one of the things that I've been kind of kicking around in my mind as well. We've talked a little bit about horror games. I think when I think horror game, I think Call of Cthulhu. I actually played a Delta Green game that for one session, which is kind of in that vein. And it almost feels like if your goal is to run a long-term horror game, I would say outside of, say, Ravenloft Curse of Strahd, because it's definitely meant to go a long time, like most D&D campaigns do. But the actual games that make that their focus, if you're really plan on running a long game, you're kind of doing it wrong, because if in a horror setting, in any horror medium I've seen, it's so based on death and dying, losing people over the course of the game, over the course of the movie, course of the book. If people are playing the same characters for an extended period of time, and yet they're running into all these horrible monstrosities and lethal situations, it kind of plays against the whole genre.
Yeah, and we really don't have any media that shows like long form horror stories. At most, you'll get like a book, like a single standalone book, or maybe a couple of books that, like, I'm thinking of Stephen King, who has books that or stories that all take place in the same world or same multiverse, but in one way or another, they're all kind of their own self-contained story. There might be a couple characters that overlap, but for the most part, each horror story is its own thing and involving its own characters. And whenever it comes to like TV series, I look at like American Horror Story as a long-running horror TV show, but that's more of an anthology series where each season is its own self-contained story, with the exception of the couple of seasons that were basically sequels to seasons that had come before it. But it was still a completely different story each season of American Horror Story.
I forgot about American Horror Story. I never really got into it, but I know a lot of people liked it. Did you guys ever watch, what is it, Haunting of Hill House? There we go.
No, I've not.
Maybe one of the better horror movies, TV series that I've dipped my feet into. I never finished it. I watched maybe 8 episodes, and it's cool. I think it might be a decent model to look at if you're going for a sort of episodic approach to your campaign. But yeah, I don't know how you could do a campaign and not have an end in mind, not have a track in mind for the players. It's not like a open world conquer the continent kind of campaign at all.
Yeah, I mean, in the games that I've either read about or heard people talk about, or really when I've looked at those settings a little bit, like, we think of campaign as like, I'm going to get my character from level 1 to level 20, and that's my goal, and that's what my DM kind of is going at as well. And I feel like when you're sitting down with a Call of Cthulhu game or something that's meant to really emphasize the horror, I would imagine if I was going to do it, I would think in terms of like a campaign, almost like 5 sessions, 6, 7 sessions, 8 sessions, which to me is, it's a fairly short game. But, what's your experience been, Clayton? Because you're by far and away the most experienced of us in that genre.
Well, I've done a couple of campaigns, using that term loosely, where it was, well, one of them, Kyle, you were in the Hunter game that was set in our southeastern Ohio region and was concerning the some of the horror elements, some of the spooky stories that are indigenous to this area. That and another game that was run in Call of Cthulhu that was also centered around southeastern Ohio. Those are the only ones where I've really experimented with trying to do a long form, like, adventure style where there's multiple adventures to go on. And I run into the problem of how to motivate the players to keep going, because you're really motivating the players rather than the characters, because the characters are either going to get killed off or they're going to see enough horrific shit that they're going to be like, well, fuck this, I'm going to move to New Orleans and just be done with all this. Referencing what one character did at the end of our Hunter game.
That comes to mind, something that really came to me a little bit ago was, I've played a lot of World of Darkness, and, some of my best moments, as a player, definitely as a player, but also as a GM, is playing in like Vampire, the Masquerade. I played probably my favorite game. One of the first games I ever played was a vampire game that started off in the Dark Ages setting, and through several series of torpors, we ended up in the modern age. And, I mean, that's very much the game was ran very much in the horror vein. I think the setting lends itself to horror. Yet it also kind of lends itself to the more D&D classic idea of a campaign, because when if you've played Vampire, you're fairly strong. It takes a lot to kill you. And so the game can run a long time, and yet it had a lot of those, it really revolves around those elements of fear and spookiness and kind of helplessness that really that kind of the horror genre thrives on. So I guess when we're talking about Call of Cthulhu, which is the first thing I come to, to me, a Call of Cthulhu game, having never actually played in one, unfortunately, I just kind of always assume that the game goes pretty much like you're a bunch of normal people, you get mixed up in some occult stuff, you have a reason to go, pursue that story hook, and then you get eaten by Cthulhu or some other silly monster by session 3, 4, or 5. And if you actually manage to live, you get driven insane, and your next character starts then, But, there are several examples where, the horror, that horror element plays a big part, Ravenloft being one, where it's not necessarily meant for you to it be a short event. So what is it about those settings that can still make them kind of horror-esque, but also long running?
Well, I think that using D&D as the basis for a horror game it requires a lot more player buy-in for it than pretty much any other. I would say that, and I run into this problem with World of Darkness games as well. The rules are built in such a way that at a certain point your characters become basically superheroes. You have superhero level of power, particularly in World of Darkness games, vampire, werewolf. I see those as just gritty superhero games. At least they eventually turn into gritty superhero games, because it's really hard to instill horror when your character can take a full magazine from a MAC-10 to the chest and just grin it off and then just drain the life out of whoever just shot you.
Yeah, I haven't experienced a whole lot of fear for, and as a player, that's hard in any imaginary game, because, how afraid can you really become whenever it's just your character on a paper that's going to die? But in all the World of Darkness games, I gotta say, the games that I've experienced the kind of Call of Cthulhu feel, or the very my character's kind of always on the edge, has been more of a World of Darkness game that's ran as a human. I think about our friend Jordan. He ran a game long ago where we played statted out versions of ourselves in our hometown, and we experienced a zombie apocalypse in our hometown, and that was a really great game. And I took it, I actually picked that up at the beginning of all this COVID stuff and ran my own version of that in World of Darkness, several months ago. And, that lethality of being just a human fighting against supernatural beings, it definitely makes the fear. It's a much different experience than when you're a fully statted out, gangrel, vampire. I think so maybe that's a different thing. Vampire is more of in my mind, a supernatural kind of, it's not necessary. Maybe it doesn't really fit the horror, description like maybe a more lethal game. So is maybe that the thing, that a horror game needs to come with an element of just the player's fragile? I think that's key, right?
Yeah, and I kind of break down horror, the different types of horror, into 3 different categories. And I would consider Vampire, not just me, it's written on the cover of the most recent Vampire book. It is a game of personal horror. In Vampire, the horror of your character is supposed to be in that your character is doing horrible things and losing their humanity, losing what made them a person along the way. And that's a very tall order for a game to convey. I've always felt like World of Darkness games, they have very awesome lore, they have very awesome stories that they are telling, but the game rules give you superheroes. It makes it so that, like, in a vampire game, you really do need to drill down onto the personal aspects of the horror in order to bring that, in order to even make it a horror game, to give your character a struggle that they have to deal with. That's why in Vampire, it's either you are a monster and you're just coming to grips with it, or in Vampire Society, you are literally just a cog in a very horrific machine, where society itself is where the horror is. And that's my second kind of horror, is the societal horror, where you're a part of a horrible organization, or a horrible mentality for your society, and just the struggle to deal with that and maintain yourself in that. My third type of horror story that I see in most role-playing games is the Call of Cthulhu. That would be the existential horror, or the cosmic horror, where you are playing a character who is completely inconsequential. You don't matter. The best thing, the most heroic thing your character can do is stave off Armageddon for just one more day.
I think that's one of the best things about cosmic horror, Lovecraftian horror, is this idea that there are things and fates worse than death, which is very dramatic, but coming to realize those, old gods waiting just at the edge of reality, or thinking about becoming some kind of like immortal husk where there's something that's possessed you and you're going to be just riding along for 1,000 years, your personality suppressed. That kind of shit really gets to you.
Yeah, as we talked about in our episode about immortality is really a horrific thing for a being to go through.
Shout out to Clayton's nerd drop a couple weeks ago. I've been chunking through Lovecraft Country, and I think it's a really great example of just what you're talking about. Getting to see Cthulhu in CGI is one of the great treats of my recent entertainment life. But yeah, that's a really good way to think about it, because breaking it down in those ways, the personal, society, existential, it does kind of, it reminds me of one of the things I've even talked to you a little bit, about gaming in general lately. I think we had a conversation about it with Clayton that, in my game with Ravenloft, one of the things I find myself missing coming from playing World of Darkness in the previous campaign I ran was just that element of sanity and humanity as a game mechanic, to where the players have something to lose outside of combat. And maybe you guys could speak about this a little bit more in Call of Cthulhu. I mean, I can't even say I've read, I don't even know who's publishing Call of Cthulhu now. I know that when I think Call of Cthulhu, I think Chaosium.
Chaosium is still doing it.
Good. But I felt like whenever I was running my World of Darkness game, I could give a player an aggravated damage, and that was, that sucked for them. But when I took away a humanity point, or I made them do I believe it's humanity or morality, when I forced them into one of those checks, it was usually outside of combat. It was usually related to something horrific, and that affected the player so much more. And then gaining the derangement system from World of Darkness and having to play that, I was lucky enough to have some good players, and they really played their derangements when they got it, and those were such interesting game mechanics that added to the game when you have players who are kind of bought into what you're trying to do, that it can make a horror game the best kind of game. It can make a game that really deals with the more, the more abstract kind of ideas of life, that humanity and derangement and going mad. It can make the game a lot more interesting and complex. It's something that I feel is really lacking. In fact, before the game, lacking in D&D, is what I meant to say. Before the game, I was reading the sanity rules in Dungeons & Dragons with a real consideration of putting it into my Ravenloft game in some way, because I feel like without that same kind of, without a way to really express on the character sheet the I don't know, the trial of going through a difficult setting, living in a difficult world, a horrific world, without finding a way to put that into a game mechanic. It can make the game feel a little bit flat. And the best games that you can run horror in really incorporate that in as an essential component of the game, in my opinion. How do they do it in Chaosium? I can't remember.
They have a sanity scale, and it's a percentile, because everything in Call of Cthulhu, or everything in Chaosium system is percentile based. Whenever you encounter something, you make a sanity roll, and you lose sanity, and depending on how much sanity you lose, either over time or in one go, you might gain temporary or long-lasting insanity or personality flaws or something like that, to reflect the fact that your character is just experiencing shit that they can't deal with. And I think that really gets to the fact that, like, in role-playing games, you're hardly ever going to be able to scare a character, and you're almost never going to be able to scare a player unless you pull out the game mechanics and make something happen that is beyond the player's control whenever they encounter something that is supposed to be frightening.
Hard agree. So what system do you guys think really, I mean, is Call of Cthulhu just the stereotypical gold standard, I guess is a better word, for horror? Or what systems really do it well in your all's mind?
All of those iterative one-shots that I ran telling the same story to different groups, they were in Fate Accelerated, which worked quite well. Character creation's quick. It's easy to learn. 2 out of the 3 groups that I'm talking about had basically negligible experience with tabletop RPGs, and so they were able to pick that up pretty quickly. I'm not saying that newbies couldn't pick up other systems we've been talking about, but I think Fate is particularly well suited for that.
I think you noted Savage World Rippers. I've never heard of such a thing. Is that a system that's kind of conducive to horror?
Well, Savage Worlds has a horror companion, and it's also got a campaign setting called Rippers. It's set in the Victorian era, and what you're doing in that setting is you are hunting down monsters. And once you hunt down a monster, you are taking parts of that monster and grafting it onto yourself in order to become more powerful, in order to take down the monsters. And it's really along the lines of be careful when you're hunting monsters, lest you become a monster. Lest you become a monster yourself. And that's really the idea behind that setting.
You know, something that pops into my mind that, you know, I definitely need some help with. So give me the solution in this conversation, guys, is scaring a character. Like, what really, from the DM side, when you're running a horror game, maybe if you've been in the player's seat, or maybe you as the DM, you figure this out. How do you really scare a player and make them feel the fear that comes with a horror setting or a horror game?
Well, I think you did a good job of the first step of it in our Curse of Strahd game, where whenever our characters very first encountered Strahd, and Jordan's character just bum rushed him and just went at him with literally everything that he had, and then Strahd just stood there, took it, and then laughed at us. Like, knowing that your character, like this big damn hero of a character that you've got, is not able to do shit against this thing that we don't quite know what it is or how it truly operates. I think that's one of the core ways of doing horror in a role-playing game. Another game, Night's Black Agents, that uses the gumshoe system, that is explicitly what you are told to do in that game. In Night's Black Agents, you play Jason Bourne style spies. Spies as capable as James Bond or Jason Bourne or anything like that. And then at some point during your investigation or during your mission, you encounter the supernatural, and you can do fuck all about it. You can do literally nothing to it. It is this unstoppable force that you then just have to do everything you can in order to survive against.
that was a really fun moment to play because, I kind of questioned myself introducing Strahd so quickly. It was the first session you guys even played in World of Darkness, and it wasn't planned. You actually, Clayton, triggered that because you bit into a story hook that was really just a small little piece. And, I even mentioned, I think that I was like, pretty sure this little child has wandered off into the woods, and the woods are very lethal, as I had mentioned several times. They're a very dangerous place to go. So, I mean, of course, so when you do that to players, what do? They run into the woods, of course. And, just making Jordan think at first that he had killed him. He staked him and then he died, and then it just was all a ruse. I think that set the tone, but I personally have struggled since then maintaining, as you guys have traveled through Barovia and you've gotten settled into the world, just maintaining that sense of spookiness has been something that I'm trying to kind of wrap my head around, making sure that's a constant, ever-present part of the game. I mean, other than just attacking you with endless amounts of random encounters, to make sure you guys know it's a very lethal place, which I personally don't like to do. I think it bogs down the story whenever you do too much. When you harass the party too much, it just bogs everything down. But if you kind of don't do that in Strahd, the world just feels like normal, and it's not supposed to feel normal at any point. So, I mean, when planning a game specifically to be horror-esque, fearful, kind of, how do you get the players, when you're planning as a DM, how can you plan for making sure the players are always looking over their shoulder and never feel completely comfortable?
We've skirted around it a little bit, but my short and sweet answer is just to really focus on the unknown. We keep saying that, it's wild to have your expectations subverted and have something be stronger than you expected. It's scary to not know what to expect. I really think that if you can craft something with a description or with a lack of a description when you've been describing everything else, if you can set, find just that right moment when your players are completely silent, and then you have them do some kind of initiative or perception check or an equivalent, or essentially signal that there's something here and you don't know what it is and you have no idea what to expect of it. I find that to be very effective.
I would say that horror games are nigh impossible to run virtually. You pretty much have to do it in everybody sitting around the table, just because literally so much more of it than in a typical game depends on the game master being able to read the table at any particular time and to be able to see when the right time to press something horrific comes up and when it's time to lay off and kind of just let the player characters stew in what they are experiencing. I don't think you're doing a bad job in Ravenloft. I feel like you're doing a pretty good job of reminding us enough that this is a very dark place where we are. Shit is bad. One reason why I say that you're doing a good job is there has been a definite tonal shift in the way that players and the characters are interacting with each other since we've entered into Barovia. We were a lot more jokey whenever we were doing Phandelver. Now, there's not really a whole lot of joking banter amongst the players.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's definitely true. But Phandelver is kind of a joke. But
personally, that's really hard. I should have designed my character better, because in a lot of ways my character is kind of that jokey type of character. But I also designed him to have some horror in his background. My character in your Strahd game is a warlock who follows the ancient hags. So I'm drawing very much from he's made deals with very malevolent fae, evil fae, and there's Grimm's fairy tales is nothing but that shit. And so
your patron eats little children who've wandered into the woods.
Right, exactly. And my character is like this most recent session, whenever we were doing that fight, and my character had this strange voice whispering if I wanted help. Well, my backstory, like, I am immediately suspicious of anything asking to just help out for any reason. So my first question was, when I heard, would you like help? My first question was, what do you want from me for this help? So I'm trying to bring it into the game where there is, like, the horror isn't just in the location. The horror is also in the way that the characters just see the world. And whenever we were doing our combat and you had this entity speaking to my character through his mind, I wanted to convey to the other player characters that something was going on there also. So I started just whispering to myself so the other players could hear what is kind of going on and question, okay, something's going on with Clayton's character. Is this something we need to be worried about?
I think you make a good connection there, like, in that last statement you just made, is that maybe instead of worrying so much about, like, I think of it like environment versus players, and like that can be NPCs, the world itself. You know, there's nothing more eerie as a player because you expect the DM to be kind of your adversary. I mean, that's the DM's role. But when you can, as a DM, sow some sort of like suspicion amongst the party themselves that maybe not everybody's on the level, or maybe not everybody's going in the same direction. You know, you expect the DM to be coming at you a little bit, but whenever you're not 100%, comfortable with these other people that are with you, that adds an extra level of insecurity and horror. I think of, like, gosh, Evil Dead, and that vein of horror is all about never feeling comfortable. And in a role-playing game, there's nothing more uncomfortable than not really completely trusting your fellow players, because you can expect it from the DM, but you never know when that player character who's been co-opted to stab you in the back. And I think that can kind of raise the hairs on the back of your neck a little bit more as a player than anything the DM can do.
So I actually want to get into, like, the planning and pacing and running of a horror game, because we've been talking for quite a while and we haven't even touched that, and that's supposed to be our whole topic. So whenever I sit down and I decide that I'm going to run a horror game, like, I start with, what type of horror do I want to do? What is the scary story I want to tell? Because I feel like if you don't have that framework of having a goal set of this is how this game is going to be a horror game, it can very easily become a situation where you're just throwing anything against the wall to see if it sticks, and there's not really a coherency behind the horror. My biggest fear whenever I'm designing a horror session or a horror game is that it will be too unconnected, that the players will just see everything as just a bunch of bad shit that happens to them, rather than this coherent story, this story that has different elements to it that are all playing into each other. One of my biggest flaws as a game master is I try to be too, I try to hide what's going on way too much, to the point where my players will get to a point and they'll just look at me and say, well, what the hell are we doing? Why are we here? What am I supposed to do next? And I feel like in horror games particularly, it's a danger of not providing enough information. You really have to look at horror in the same way that you look at mystery games, where there's a very fine line between giving them enough to keep them engaged, to keep them wanting to go down these dark paths, go off into the unknown, and not just feel so helpless and feel like their characters are so inconsequential that nothing they do matters.
Yeah, I think we could describe that in the oh shit moment. I like that term that you that you laid out ahead of time that, you know, something that came to my mind as you were talking was, you know, if you're a game master and you're planning out a game and you happen to be lucky enough to kind of know your players, if you really think about who you're playing with, you can make them uncomfortable as much as possible. So when you're planning your storyline, you know, you think yourself like, you know, I hate to keep referencing the game that we're playing now and the people that we play with, but we all, you know, anybody who's listening to this, and you guys know our friend Jordan, you know, in my experience, he typically plays loners who don't have a lot of connections, and he typically, just as an example, likes to play with not too many connections, not a lot of distractions. So, you know, one thing I worked into the game was that, unbeknownst to him, he was going to be put into a moral kind of battle with himself in a way as a player, because unbeknownst to him, he had a lot of connections to Barovia, and all of a sudden his loner, you know, player type and character that he made in the game, lo and behold, finds that there's a lot of, you know, family connections that he has to now have to deal with, that you know, and that was just an example of how, you know, when you're planning ahead, you know, I think horror is all about curveballs. And if the player gives you something that you can do to throw them a curveball, that's great. But if you really know your players ahead of time, you can all really plan ahead to put them in an uncomfortable position. If a player doesn't like to really be responsible for a lot of people's well-being, well, then they need to be responsible for a lot of people's well-being. You know, if a player likes to always, you know, find an easy, simple, good path, well, then their path needs to be nothing but gray, so that they have this internal, they're constantly in an internal conflict with themselves. And, you know, when I think Cthulhu, I always imagine, you know, they discover a book that leads them to a clue that takes them down into a deep, dark ruin where it all plays out in a very discreet, dungeon-esque kind of, you know, environment where you end up getting eaten by a monster. But, you know, looking back at in some of the most horrific, you know, movies and media that I've ever found, it's whenever the world itself has gone crazy, whenever it's so much more scary whenever the evil isn't held in one small, discreet spot. But when the world itself goes nuts, if you can make the world go crazy, kind of like in a zombie game, when players find themselves completely surrounded by nothing but terrible situations, that can kind of lend itself to good, you know, that's kind of your butter zone. That's where you want to live in a horror game, you know?
Yeah, and whenever I talk about the oh shit moment, which that's trademarked by me, is oh shit moments in RPGs, that's when the player characters are learning what's at stake. Either they are, like in the example you gave of Jordan's character, he's learning that he's got a lot of connections in this place where he didn't know he had these connections, and he has something he has to fight for. Or in some horror games where the characters suddenly realize what exactly they have to face off against. Where they find out what the odds truly are. And that the odds are stacked against them. That's what I mean by the oh shit moment. And I also mean by oh shit moment the moment where something surprising and horrific happens. Where, like, one resource that I found online that is really, really good for just basically pacing out a scenario is The Trajectory of Fear by Ash Law. There will be a link in the show notes for this. And one of the things that he says in this 9-page essay on how to design horror role-playing games or role-playing game scenarios is that whenever you're playing the game, you're going to want to go through constant cycles of unease and dread. Unease is where things aren't quite right, and dread is you're realizing that something has to be done, and that thing is something that either you can't do or that is something that you're not, that is against your character in some way. It's some form of struggle that your character is going to have to overcome in the context of a horror game.
I know that I can think of a bunch of oh shit moments as a player. I think that comes to mind more than as a DM, because you're trying to, concoct a no shit moment, but I think for the players it's a lot more impactful because you actually have to live the oh shit. I tried to build one in the last session. I guess it was 2 sessions ago. Curse of Strahd really lays that out. It gives you the option to do a no shit moment, but when I was, the thing about any role playing game that's pre-packaged, if you go online, there's just an endless amount of extra content that you can add. And in the Ravenloft game that the players are running in now, there was this kind of like sanctuary that I had set up for them, that they had to go to a particular place and find this holy person who was going to help them, get a key plot point. And so the players, had a couple distractions, and they ended up having to go other places. But finally, after about 2 sessions, they finally get to go to the place that they were aiming to go, and they finally get there, and they get access to the town, and they finally go all the way up to see this person and this place that has, which I tried to set up as kind of like a sanctuary. And then they show up and they find out that it's a complete 180, that the place itself is a madhouse and not a holy place. The person they're seeking is a totally bananas, out of his mind, crazy person who then makes a very lethal one. So it's the way I hoped it would play out was the players would expect, finally we've gotten to this place and now we're going to get the sanctuary and the help that we need. And it turned out to be completely the opposite, and they ended up having a terrible, a completely terrible confrontation. The reason why I liked, and I went with that as I went with it more as the extra content was written rather than the way the book was written, was I felt like that was a much more unsettling moment for the players to live through. I mean, maybe you can speak to that more from the player side, Clayton, but I can think of, oh shit moments are what I live for in a game whenever things don't turn out the way they're supposed to. And some of my best role-playing experiences in the past were oh shit moments. I mean, horror when done right, they're the best games. But when they're done wrong, oh my goodness, they can be kind of a bore. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And whenever you were saying like this about the oh shit moment in the Curse of Strahd game, I had to continue listening to you because I wasn't quite sure which one you were going to be talking about, because you've been doing really well with making sure that each session, well, maybe not each session, but each mini arc of the game, each location that we are on, or that we are at, has something going on where there is an oh shit moment. Like whenever we thought we were in a safe town, and we go up into an attic, and oh, by the way, there are so many vampires up here that we are going to get our asses handed to us. And then we did get our asses handed to us. That was an oh shit moment from several angles. One, in character, we were learning, oh, we thought this place was safe, but it's not. And out of character, it was, you thought you guys were the heroes here? Well, you guys aren't shit, because there are things here that are just going to wipe the floor with you. And there's not a damn thing you can do about it except run away if you are smart.
I love that moment too, because it was completely accidental. That was, I'm glad looking back on it that moment I didn't, modify it, because I think had I realized, had I realized how lethal that confrontation was going to be, I may have kind of scaled it back a little bit. But, that's probably going to be one of the memories that people have, from the game, that like when they walk in, they think they're big dick heroes, and then they get confronted with an absolutely overwhelming foe, but that's so difficult to do, because if you constantly are doing, if you do that over and over again, what happens? You eventually just TPK your party. And I guess we're speaking more in the D&D world, where it's assumed that the players are going to kind of get drawn out and the game's going to last a while. And we all know that D&D really favors player survival, which is completely different than a Call of Cthulhu or a Chaosium system in general. I think that a game really designed for horror is a game designed for the players to die if they don't mind their P's and Q's, you know. Horror is difficult in 5e, in my opinion, because especially whenever players mature a little bit and they get some power underneath their belts, it can kind of almost seem like you're stacking the deck against them whenever you're putting really lethal foes in their path. You know what I mean?
Well, there's a balance there to make sure that you present challenges, but you don't destroy hope. Hope is the core emotion of a horror game. It's not actually fear and dread. It's hope that is the core emotion of a horror game, because you have to feel like something can be accomplished. There is some good that can be eked out from all of this horrific shit that is going down. If there isn't some hope, then it's all pointless, and you might as well just commit suicide then and there. It just makes the game not fun if there's no hope.
Maybe I'm kind of like revealing my geek moment in a bit, but I think a really great example from fantasy is the Elric of Melniboné character in that book. I don't know how many people will. Are you familiar with Elric in that series, Clayton or KP?
My familiarity with Elric is from the songs from power metal bands that have been made about it.
I mean, it's a dark fantasy world written by Michael Moorcock, and I happen to. It's one of those fantasies that a lot of my friends have been into that I've never read. So it just so happened that recently a buddy of mine gave me the complete set of the books, which I had wanted for a long time. I've recently found out that they're like super hard to get out. Like, fine, they're not really in print. You kind of have to go to used markets to get the books. But that the main character is almost like the anti-Frodo. He's very morally conflicted. He doesn't really fit in, and it's just he's constantly making choices that are kind of like, choices that aren't good but are for the greater good. You know what I mean? And when you're putting your players in that position, that's making them, if you can do that in a role-playing game, that makes them uncomfortable. And, to me, and you're right, I never really thought of it that way, but hope is kind of the key element of horror, because how else are you going to convince players to do something that is not necessarily in their personal best interest? It has to be with the promise that they're going to make a sacrifice that actually helps more than just themselves. And I guess that can also show how horror as a role-playing setting can be difficult, because if you don't have players that are of that mindset, if you don't have players who buy in to, be willing to serve the greater good, even if it comes at their expense or a compromise, it's going to be difficult to get your players to follow the paths that you need.
Yeah, and whenever you're getting ready to run a horror game, most of the time, I think it's imperative that the game master let the players know that. Most of the time, if you didn't tell your players that you were going to be playing a horror game and just suddenly foisted it upon them, like in the oh shit moment they learn that they are actually in a horror game, you might have just complete checkout from the players that they don't want to play this type of game. It takes a very specific mindset when you're playing in order to enjoy a horror game, because they typically do involve uncomfortable things that are either happening or that your characters have to grapple with either physically or mentally or socially. And I've always fantasized about running a game where the players didn't know that they were in a horror game until like several sessions into it, and then suddenly just do this huge reveal of, oh, by the way, this setting is a horror setting, and shit is about to go very, very bad for everyone. I would love to play that, but I feel like there aren't as many players who would be as open to that if you didn't spell it out ahead of time.
Yeah, I definitely asked permission. I believe that I was pretty upfront when we were playing Fandelver, just because it was such a tonal shift. I think there was a moment where we were coming close to the end of Fandelver that I revealed to you guys out of character, hey, I kind of want to run Curse of Strahd, and it's a pretty big tone shift. I completely agree with that, because if you don't have players who understand where they're going, and that was probably true with my Delta Green game. I didn't really know anything about the game setting, and we only played one game. But I didn't really make a character that was. I guess I just really didn't come at the game with really a complete understanding. I just kind of rushed the rules and made a character that was just kind of like I think he was like a special agent man or something like that, or like a special forces military dude. And I felt like the setting really dropped like a rock for me, because the player that I made was not completely. And me as a player, I wasn't completely bought into the idea that we were playing horror. But at the same time, we only played one, so had we gone on, I think that that would have developed. But you definitely have to have player buy-in to do a horror game. If not, it's just going to be a shit show. Though I will say, you had mentioned earlier about your character being a little bit lighter, a little bit more jokey. I'm pretty sure everybody would agree that your character in general, the levity, you're always the one that brings the jokes. You're always the one that, when the DM puts something that's clearly a bad choice in front of the players, you're the first one to buy in and just go for it with full force. You have to have humor in a horror game. There has to be moments of levity, and when as a DM, you get so bogged down in the game and the setting and the prep and all that stuff. By the time you run the game, you're not always the best source for that. So having a player who's willing to or able to inject a little bit of humor and jokiness into those moments of tense or just intense moments, those are often the best moments in the session. And Wade he's the king of that in our game. Your warlock. I know that the most laughs that we've had. I think you know that it's been funny whenever Jordan cracks up, and I think you have the record for cracking most everybody up. So keep playing it.
Whenever I make a joke in character, that is my metric to determine whether or not it was a good joke. Is if I can make Jordan laugh.
Yeah. If he's laughing, usually you've done something right.
And in a horror game, it's inevitable that somebody is going to try to crack a joke whenever things are at its most dire, when things are at its worst, because that's how humans deal with the horrific. There's a lot of very gallows humor. You can read about the types of jokes that Holocausts are people in concentration camps in the Holocaust, the types of jokes they told to each other while they were getting exterminated. It's as core to humanity as anything that jokes are one of the ways that you do put a little bit of hope into the situation, that yes, there is a way to get through this if we can just get through this.
I think a really good time to bring out some of that humor is if you're able to introduce a sort of calm before the storm, or maybe there's already been a storm and now there's kind of an after calm, and it's actually really important to try or encourage others to lighten the mood. Don't fight that, because not only are you going to get a better scare the next time that things get scary, but it's also just really important to pace things and let off of the spookiness. Let people breathe for a while.
I mean, there's a reason why Evil Dead transitioned into Army of Darkness. There's only so much. There's only so far you can take horror. Humor is horror's best friend. That's why whenever I was talking to Jordan, because before I started doing Ravenloft, I talked to Jordan. I was like, it'd be really cool to have Clayton and Kyle in this game. I would imagine that's probably something that is a strength for UKP. Playing the games that I've only ran the one game with you, but I've listened to many of the podcasts, and and we've socialized quite a bit. I would love. There's an alternate universe where you were able to play in the Ravenloft campaign where the jokiness was at a maximum. I think that probably, from what I gather, is one of your strengths. We definitely got to get in a game, man. Like, I definitely need to run in a game or play in a game or run a game with you in it, because I think that without having played with you very much, I just intuitively feel like that's probably a strength you would have in a horror game.
Yeah, man, absolutely. I mean, I had a good time when you came to Athens and ran that one off there in my living room, for sure.
You got to have that person. If everybody's deadpan and nobody's outgoing, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's horror or just vanilla D&D, that game's probably not going to last that long. I mean, if people aren't laughing at the table, then nobody's having much fun.
From a DM's perspective, there's nothing more satisfying than breaking your charismatic character to a point where they don't even know what to say in a horror game.
Ain't that the truth? What more can we say about horror? I'm an advocate in these COVID times, and who knows how long this shit's gonna last, but having run on Roll20, and so many of my friends from my youth have spread so far out of the country. I'm in a game right now with obviously you guys who live in Athens, a couple hours away from me. I'm playing in another game with dudes on the West Coast who I grew up with, who moved 4 time zones away from me. I'm a big fan of the Roll20 medium. I gotta say, I'm a huge advocate for webcams. I know this is a little bit off topic, but if there's so much added value in a game when you can see your players and the players can see you, whether it be at the best obviously choice is to be there with them. But if that's not an option, I have found that whenever you're playing with webcams, because in the game that I play in, we all have, we don't even play in Roll20. We play just on Discord with video chat. There's definitely an added element to that. So those of you who are running games out in the world, if you're listening to this, if you're not sure whether or not you want to use webcams, me personally, I highly recommend it, because it feels more like you're at the table.
Yeah. And something else I would recommend, but whether you are virtual or whether you are physically there, horror games are the games most often that I would use background music for. I'm not a huge fan of background music in most situations. I've tried it with varying degrees of success in the past, but I feel as long as you have some relatively soft music that can just kind of be ambiance. It doesn't have ideally it doesn't have lyrics. It has something that you don't have any trouble talking over. If you can have some sort of background music to set the mood, that is awesome. Spotify and YouTube have so many lists of horror music, either from movies or video games. Curse of Strahd had Wizards of the Coast made their own Curse of Strahd soundtrack that is available on YouTube. We've been, well, I don't know if everybody, but I know some of us have been having selections of that playing in the background during Eliot, during your game.
Yeah, we played it that very first session. Me, as a DM, I haven't really pushed it that much. That's probably something that I could grow into a little bit more, because I've had DMs in the past, be it at the table, really at the table, that, used some of the most basic things, lighting. I remember when, I have a game that I played in right before COVID where the DM was really great at crafting, miniatures and set design and stuff. And when he had a dramatic moment, dude, he had a playlist, he'd hit that playlist, he'd dim the lights. It adds a lot.
Yeah, and dimming anything you would do for watching a horror movie, do it at night, do it with the lights down, really enhances the mood. If you can have some sort of a prop, and right now, as of the time of this recording, we're getting toward Halloween. Halloween stores are opening up. Stores that sell like Walmart and Target and stuff, like places like that, are starting to sell Halloween supplies. I usually stock up this time of year for things that I see that might be useful either as a prop or as a game aid. Now's the time I stock up. Between Halloween and start of school, I do a lot of buying for my games this time of year.
Oh, the times when you could rely on being face-to-face with your players or DM and actually do that stuff. I hope that those times return soon.
Yeah, me too. Certainly been making getting into any kind of usually in-person, now remote hobby very difficult.
Though I will say I've played more games during COVID than I have, golly, in any stretch of my life prior. It's been a real refuge.
It's like that episode of The Twilight Zone. We've got all this time, but no glasses, except glasses equals motivation? I don't know.
Oh, what a great reference. Yeah, that's a dope-ass episode.
All right, guys, you want to move on to geek things?
Yeah, for sure.
Sure.
All right, I'll go first. My geek thing is a book. The book is It's Only a Joke, Comrade. Humor, Trust, and Everyday Life Under Stalin by Jonathan Waterlow. I've been reading through this. I'm about a quarter of the way. It's all about what things were like in Stalinist Russia and the types of jokes that the everyday people told about Stalin and his cronies, and it's given me a lot of insight as to just kind of how people deal with horrific things.
Go ahead, KP.
Why don't you take it?
Well, I had one, but you saying that, I have to mention this fucking movie. Anybody has Netflix, which, if you don't have Netflix, who are you? Where do you live? I don't understand. But there's a movie on Netflix called Death of Stalin. It has some big names that I can't recall, some really great actors in it, but it is a tongue-in-cheek humor take on the moments after Stalin dies, and it's a great movie. I really recommend it to anybody who just wants a laugh, who really enjoys history and stuff like that, because it's really, really funny. But what I kind of already, spoiled it earlier. What I came with was Elric of Melniboné and the Elric Eternal Champion books in general. I visited Athens, and Jordan gave me the whole set. I'd already told him that I wanted to read it. It's, to me, in the circles I've ran in, it's a classic for fantasy. And yet, I've discovered after the fact it's not in print. You have to buy it on on eBay, or, you have to pay kind of a premium on Amazon to get it from a used bookseller. But those books are amazing. I did not expect to be completely engulfed in a book. They're very short. There's like 7 or 8 books in the series, but they're less than 200 pages each. And I think it took me 5 hours to read the first book. I opened the first page to lay down to go to bed, and Michael Moorcock's Tale of Elric at this moment in my life, it has consumed me. They're really great. Anybody who loves fantasy, Lord of the Rings, whatever, if that's in your kind of wheelhouse, pay the extra premium and get Michael Moorcock, and get the Elric of Melniboné series. That's the name of the first book. Get that, you'll be hooked. They're great books. They're essential reading for any fantasy fan.
And just as an additional tidbit, you can thank the Michael Moorcock Elric books for the law to chaos axis of the alignment system, because those are the books that inspired them to put that into the D&D.
Makes sense.
So mine is, I guess, slightly movie related. It's a subreddit. It's called Full Movies on YouTube. If you're unfamiliar with Reddit, who are you? Where do you live? But it's
right.
It's an online community that is a really great place that has kind of replaced a lot of like forums. There are still a lot of active ones out there, but they've kind of died off, and Reddit has these little holes that you can go and join a community. There's also some horse shit. I suppose all of Reddit is not a great place, but whatever. Anyway, if you look up Full Movies on YouTube, Reddit in Google, you'll find the link, or our show notes. Anyway, I would not and will not ever encourage you to pirate media. Do not do it. But one...
Never, of course.
Never. And if you happen to see one of many links on Full Movies on YouTube to something copyrighted, just don't click them. Don't do it. But
definitely do not do mega torrents that have every role-playing book
No,
ever made.
the trove should not exist. However, the point of this is that on this subreddit, which is pretty well curated, it's a list of just full movies on YouTube, as the title would indicate. You're going to find a lot of really obscure shit, the kinds of things that you would find in flea markets on VHS tape in 2001. And, I mean, movies that you're like, holy shit, how have I never heard of this? I watched several. The video quality is never great, and in a lot of cases it really is a VHS tape rip. But I'd recommend Megaville, a really weird 1990 cyberpunk movie, and also Moon 44, a really weird, I think also 1990 sci-fi movie with a lot of really great models and props. It was Roland Emmerich's first big budget movie. He did the Stargate movie, Independence Day, the director. But really, go and find, you can sort by decade, find some weird stuff and scratch that itch. If you, like me, have the itch to go to a flea market and buy a bunch of weird old VHS tapes, but you can't because the flea markets are full of anti-vaxxers and people who don't wear masks.
All right, guys. Well, you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Let's do it.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.